the solutions that matter to us as individuals must be custom tailored to our own circumstances and our own lives.
Okay.
And we have to ask ourselves, how much do we value things like liberty and freedom?
Exactly.
How much do we value independence of thought, of mind? Because after all, that word government, controller of minds, that's where it comes from. You look it up, the etymological root is controller of the mind. This is what government means. How much do we own our own lives? How much do we demand to own our own labor?
Yes.
How much do we demand to own and control the real estate between our own ears? These are the questions that I always ask, and so in lieu of a example, it really doesn't matter what the example is. I always have to ask myself, is this really my fight?
Yes. Yeah.
And why aren't they proposing it this way? Because almost invariably, every single time when I'm presented with some kind of conflict, desirous of a solution, I have to ask myself where I, as an individual, and those people in my life that I care about the most, where do they actually fit? And almost invariably, every time I realize that this is nothing more than a setup.
Right. Quite right. In fact, it causes me to think about one of the recent and very significant examples being the big bailout. The very phrase itself, "too big to fail," makes me throw up a little bit in my mouth each time I hear it used. And unfortunately, that's every day because it's constantly around us that people employ that kind of faulty logic. It's a fallacy of logic, and yet the bailout itself, the big bank bailout, the TARP legislation of 2008 is, I think, a prime reference point to this whole situation. The Hegelian dialectic itself, problem, reaction, solution, and then as you've described, there's a right approach and a wrong approach, I think, or a faulty one for each individual citizen to take as they look at that sort of thing. And unfortunately, what they, I think, try to get us to do is have that lemming-type response because of the fear, the pucker factor, and to get people to go along with that predefined solution that they had in mind from the beginning. Your thoughts there, Lark?
Well, absolutely. I concur. You know, it's interesting to me how language is employed today. Not just within the constructs of Hegelian dialectic. You know, very often we use words that we presuppose everybody kind of knows the definition of this particular word that we employ freely,
okay,
often unthinkingly, and when nothing could be further from the truth. When we use words like conservative,
yeah,
or liberal, libertarian even, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
How many of us presuppose that we kind of have a darn good handle on what those words mean? And yet when we look those words up and really do a little bit of even cursory research, we realize that there are several definitions for these words. And how can we be certain that the people that we're trying to communicate with have the same understanding of the definition and meaning of the words that we banty about, thinking, well, heck, everybody knows what these words mean.
That is such a great point, Lark, that you make. In fact, I remember, I'll never forget, I've forgotten exactly which election cycle year this was that it took place, but I won't forget what happened, which is the local party structure, and this is when I was quite a lot younger. It was the Republican Party structure, but what I thought was interesting is that local organizer had many of the volunteers in the room. He said, "What does conservative mean? I'd like you to write down your definition of that." And there were about 20 people in the room, and you had really about 18 different, almost very different definitions that were uttered. And I think that's a perfect example of what you're referring to. And yet in casual conversation, we all just jump right into the mix. You just hear that buzzword and you fly right into it without first establishing what it is each of us thinks we're talking about.
Well, of course, when we think about definition, we have to think about nuances of meaning, or what we term shadings of meaning.
Ah.
And even with those nuances and shadings, which we can't often express, because oftentimes in the same conversation, we mean this nuance and shading of meaning, this definition for this word, whereas in another sentence, as part of the same discussion, we have an alternative nuance or shading of meaning for the same word because it's applied within a different context.
Okay.
Perhaps.
Yep.
And so what this is tantamount to really living in a time when we think we're communicating with other people when in fact we really are not.
We're talking right past each other a lot of the time, aren't we?
Yes, we're like two positive poles of a magnet. They repel instead of attract.
Well said. Very well said. And in fact, you know, those thoughts you've just shared, Lark, to me what makes them even more chilling, exponentially more chilling, is when I look at the text of something like this presidential directive or executive directive 51, which grants absolute power almost to the president. Well, I might as well call it absolute power. It's as close as you can get to it because it bypasses congressional oversight. It bypasses judicial branch oversight. And the terms, the way that it's defined in an event of a catastrophic emergency, and such emergency is construed as any incident, regardless of location. That means outside of the country also, that results in extraordinary levels of mass casualties, damage, or disruption severely affecting the U.S. population, infrastructure, environment, economy, or government functions. For example, just the term severely affecting. That's I think, a good example of what you mean. What's the definition of that? How do we measure when something has been severely affected? And oh, by the way, it's at the discretion of the president himself to make that assessment without having a definition that we've all agreed upon. Would that maybe be an example of?
Well, of course, the language has been construed and deliberately put forward so as to provide a wide breadth of latitude, if you will.
Kind of a blank check, isn't it?
In other words, subject to interpretation by the people who claim authority.
Quite right. Yep.
And it's deliberately put forward that way. And it's really good for the lawyers because, of course, the lawyers get to play with words and police their clients because they can twist these words in any number of ways to line their pockets.
Exactly.
Forgive me for saying something about lawyers. I'm not particularly fond of them.
Well, Lark, I'm not going to gnaw off my own leg defending them in this case either. I think we're right there together on that front. You know, I just think about this problem reaction solution sequence, the Hegelian dialectic, this perverted weird logic where in essence the end is, justifies the means. And it causes me to think again about the bank bailout, the TARP legislation, and something I've stumbled across doing some of my research. Past programs, folks have heard me going all the way back to the Emergency Banking Act, 1933, how that was really the nail in the coffin. That, of course, is when the U.S. bankruptcy began. A lot of people think that's just saying it, colorfully or poetically, but no, it's for real, folks. We are in bankruptcy and have been since that time. And what struck me, Lark, one of the things I found is in that case back then, and this is exactly like the TARP legislation. I'm going to quote from this piece talking about the Emergency Banking Act of 1933. The sense of urgency was such that the act was passed with only one single copy available on the floor of the House, and most legislators voted on it without reading it. And that is precisely what we heard about the TARP legislation, the bank bailout for the too big to fails, et cetera, in 2008. Isn't it interesting how history has a way of repeating itself?
Absolutely. And it just happens over and over again because people, individuals, refuse to take heed and understand that history is always written by the winners.
There you go. And folks, history is doomed to repeat itself. Those who are not aware of history are doomed to get freight trained by it. Join us again after the break, folks. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen of the RBN listening audience, to the Crimson Pill. I am your host, Antonin Feori, and we're privileged to be joined by the future host of this Saturday afternoon, 2 to 3 p.m. Central Time slot, Lark in Texas. Lark is with me. We've been talking about the Hegelian Dialectic and the weird, demented reasoning, if you can call it that, because it's really not, but that's employed by the leaders, these governmental institutions, as their mechanisms of control of us, the folks that pay the bills for all of this. We're rewarded in kind by their manipulations, problem, reaction, solution that drive us into freely giving away one liberty after the next. And Lark, I can't tell you how much I appreciate this chance to have this conversation. I'm hoping that we'll be able to kind of renew it on future programs. You've got a program and I've got a program now, so we would have opportunities, I think, to be able to do that. But I'm also curious to hear a little bit about your thoughts. Maybe you could kind of share with the listeners about your either your vision or some thoughts you have in mind for your show.
Well, I have long been fascinated by words, and that's rather a curse. I liken it to suffering from an affliction known as the tyranny of words. The hyphenated term, tyranny of words.
Okay.
But I'm hoping to just continue the conversations that I've been enjoying listening to with the RBN audience. Because I can't tell you, in the past 2 years that I've listened to RBN, I'm always struck by the wisdom of the callers to RBN.
Excellent point, yes.
And so I relish the opportunity to continue whatever dialogues are necessary, because it's perhaps quite true. We may not have the freedom to have these needed discussions, these conversations that have been denied us for so long. Much more in the future. So I think we need to use this time wisely to speak truth to power, and also perhaps invite some introspection. Look ourselves in the mirror and ask how it is that we are contributing to the enslavement of our fellow man, if not ourselves.
Absolutely right. By our inaction. How do we contribute to that enslavement if we don't move our own feet? Is that fair to say?
Well, absolutely, but always remember, and I know you know this, Antonin, slavery begins in the mind. All actions begin in the mind.
Yep.
The mind is what directs our feet.
Quite right.
So we want to be fully apprised of the facts, as they truly exist, as much as possible in every situation, so that we can make sound, rational decisions about where our feet are directed.
Quite right. Very, 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 very true. Well, folks, as we come up here on the top of the hour, just a quick reminder, my show, The Crimson Pill, is moving to Sunday evenings from 7 to 9 Central Time. Starting next Saturday at 2 o'clock is Lark in Texas hosting his show. The highest rated time slot in all of Internet radio, Saturday from 2 to 3. Well, maybe it's in the top 100. But make sure you join Lark next week. Lark, thank you so much for being with me today. Congratulations again, and we're so excited to have you on RBN.
Well, I appreciate you and RBN and all the listeners. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks now. See you next week, folks. Bye-bye.